Hi, everybody. Please take your seats. We're going to move on to the next one. So welcome to Competitive Advantage, presented by Ticketmaster. My name is Devin Shapiro. I'm a first-year MBA at MIT Sloan, and it's my pleasure to announce our next speaker, how sport can address the integrity challenges arising from sports betting, Ian Lynham.
Hey, thanks, Devin. So, a row of bronze statues of Zeus was erected at Olympia in 388 BC as a warning to all athletes not to follow the path taken by Eupolis of Thessaly, a boxer who paid 3 opponents to take a dive in the ancient Olympics. For as long as competitive sport has existed, it has had to protect itself from individuals who seek to corrupt that which makes sport special, fair play and uncertainty of outcome. And in the past 20 years, the growth and change in sports betting has been explosive. The advent of internet betting and exchange betting has changed how we bet on sport. Streaming and the availability of live data has greatly increased the number of betting opportunities. And the repeal of PASPA is opening huge new markets in the US to legalize sports betting for the first time. And this change and growth in sports betting increases the susceptibility of sport to corruption. And today's talk is going to look at how sport can meet those challenges. So firstly, we're going to look at the independent review of integrity in tennis, which is the largest piece of work in this area, which has been carried out in world sport. And then we'll look at seeking to identify and go through a number of key considerations for all sports in seeking to meet these challenges. So tennis. The tennis review, it was started in early 2016. The governing bodies of tennis, appointed a 3-person panel to review integrity in the sport. And this came on the back of The Tennis Racket, a joint BBC BuzzFeed expose on match fixing in the sport. And the panel consisted of Adam Lewis, an English barrister, Beth Wilkinson, a US attorney, and Mark Henselin, a Swiss lawyer. And our team at Northridge were appointed as solicitors and secretariat to the panel. The panel's role was to address the nature and extent of the integrity problems in the sport over time, the appropriateness and effectiveness of the sport's historical approach and present approach to addressing those problems, and to make recommendations about potential changes to improve how the sport tackles the problem in the future. And the governing bodies committed in advance to implement any recommendations which resulted from the review. So the panel published its interim report in April 2018. It's hard to underestimate the scale of the process in putting this review together. There was many millions of pages of documents to review, a huge amount of data, 200 written submissions from stakeholders in the sport, 115 interviews with professional players were undertaken around the world, and 3,400 responses to surveys were received from professional players. And the panel found that the nature and extent of the integrity problem in the sport was indeed serious and substantial. And you can see on the screen a chart which shows the number of match-specific betting alerts in the sport between 2009 and 2018, broken down by levels of the sport. So the black line being the composite, the blue line being the lowest levels, orange medium levels, and down to the elite level. So the chart clearly shows that although no level of tennis is immune from betting-related integrity concerns, the problem was most pervasive at those lower levels. And 3 relevant factors were identified by the panel. First, the nature of tennis lends itself to manipulation for betting purposes. So there are a huge number of bettable events in tennis. You can bet on the outcome of a point, a game, a set, a match, aces, double faults. You only need to corrupt one player, so one player on their own can impact on the result. Detection is difficult, particularly at the lower levels where there's no spectators and the infrastructure around the sport isn't sufficient to protect the participants from bad actors. And tanking, or deliberate underperformance, has historically been accepted within the sport. So factor 2, the player incentive structure created a fertile breeding ground for breaches of integrity. So there were 14,000 nominally professional players in world tennis, but only 300 of them were actually making money from playing the sport. So this lack of alignment between prize money and the cost in participating in the sport created a risk for corruption. And the third factor, online betting and the sale of official live scoring data had greatly exacerbated the problem. So before 2013, there was no official data available in tennis. And post the data deals that were done after 2013, then the live data for up to 60,000 matches a year was streamed into the betting markets around the world. And if you look at the chart, you can see the impact from 2013 of those lines in the level of reports. So there was a massive growth in the amount of betting on tennis, and that created additional opportunities for corruption. So the final report was published in December 2018, and it concluded that there's no simple solution or panacea to deal with the problem now faced. But it set out 12 recommendations to try and address this integrity problem. And the recommendations seek to achieve three things. They seek to address the underlying issues which were causing the problem. They seek to address and limit the betting markets which were driving the issue. And they seek to improve the integrity function within tennis to better address these issues. So the recommendations are set out on my slides. I think given the time limitations we have today, I'm not going to be able to go through the 12 of them in any detail, but the entire report is available on the IRP website to download. It's 120 pages, but there's a pretty accessible executive summary at the front setting out the recommendations. And anyone who is interested in this area, I would urge you to download it and go through it in your own time. I think since the report was published in December, there was immediately further confirmation of the extent of the issue. In January, there was a crackdown in Spain, and over 80 people were arrested in relation to an investigation into an Armenian crime gang that had been fixing tennis matches at those lower two levels. So there is considerable work that remains to be done. So moving then to section 2. From our work in integrity across sports, so tennis, but also in football and in horse racing, we've sought to identify key considerations which apply to all sports and which should be borne in mind when a sport is thinking about how it addresses its integrity concerns. So the first consideration is susceptibility to corruption. So this is important. There's no one-size-fits-all solution to integrity. Every sport is different, and every level of every sport is different. So we've identified seven factors which go to making up a sport's susceptibility. So number 1, the size of the betting markets. Number 2, historic corruption issues within the sport. 3, the number of betting opportunities, the availability of live markets and live data in the sport. 4, the sophistication of the infrastructure around the sport, the ability to identify and protect against bad actors. 5, the ability of an individual on his own to fix outcome of a score, event, etc., without detection. 6, the tolerance of tanking or deliberate underperformance within the sport that was identified in tennis as effectively the seeds of corruption in some cases. And 7, the alignment of financial incentives within the sport. So to illustrate those last couple of points, I'm going to use sumo and the work done by Levitt and Dubner in Freakonomics, which some of you will be already familiar with.
A Rikshi entering a tournament's final 15th match with a 7-7 record has far more to gain from a victory than an opponent with a record of, say, 8-6 has to lose. If a wrestler has 8 wins under his belt, he is guaranteed to advance, even if he loses that last match. So he can afford to take a fall. In Japan, there's a term for match rigging, yaocho. Many suspected that sumo matches might be rigged, but it is nearly impossible to prove unless you look closely at the numbers.
2 wrestlers who I would expect to have an even match, when one of them needs the 8th win and the other doesn't, the one who needs it wins 75% of the time rather than 50% of the time. That is a huge deviation.
I, 8-6 wrestler, let you, 7-7 wrestler, win this deciding match because you, my friend, are going to fall down the pyramid if you don't. In return, the next time those two guys meet, lo and behold, the 8-6 wrestler almost always wins those matches.
And the Freakonomics hypothesis was borne out subsequently in that a match-fixing scandal broke out in sumo, and evidence came to light of wrestlers exchanging wins and losses in this way. So the numbers ultimately told the truth. So consideration 2, relationship with the betting industry. It's important that the betting industry is seen as part of the solution, and ultimately the interests between sport and betting are aligned in that both want uncertainty of outcome. But the approach taken to some issues such as sponsorship does differ between sports. And it has been notable, post-PASPA, with the US leagues entering into betting partnerships at the same time as, leagues and governing bodies in some of the sports around the world have actually been moving away from betting partnerships, such as the FA and the Davis Cup. The sale of live scoring data. So as we identified in tennis, the decision to sell live scoring data is a substantial one. There is a lot of revenue which can be generated, but it needs to come with integrity safeguards to protect against potential issues, including ensuring that betting operators who subscribe for the live data enter into memorandum of understanding, which require them to share betting data in relation to suspicious betting patterns with the sport. Integrity fees or levies are something that work well in horse racing and greyhound racing in the UK, and obviously are on the table in the US and being pushed for by some of the leagues. Okay, consideration 3, role of data. So there are two important data streams here, and it's important to understand the distinction between them. There's the sale of the live data, the event data, the scoring data, and then there's the data that comes back from the betting markets. So the live data is used by the sport, it's sold to generate revenues, and it's what's used to create the betting markets. It's important that sport carries out a risk assessment, both on whether or not it sells its data, but also on what data it sells, and in particular, whether the data sale will lead to markets being created on vulnerable areas of the sport, such as youth levels, semi-professional levels, and so on. Sport can prohibit the onward sale of the official data, so ensure that its data isn't onward sold to operators who haven't entered into MOUs or who are also using unofficial data. They should include termination provisions so that if the sale of the data ultimately results in unforeseen consequences, then the data can be turned off. And they should include provisions for disruption of live scoring or streaming in relation to specific concerns on particular events. So the second data stream then, the betting data. The betting data is used to monitor suspicious betting activity. It's basically a quantitative and qualitative approach that's used to identify whether or not activity is in fact suspicious. It's very important. It's one tool basically in the integrity function toolkit. It is not the solution on its own. However, it can be used very successfully to establish cases. So I'm using a case study of Joseph Lamptey. So Lamptey was a Ghanaian referee. He was the referee in the World Cup qualifier between Senegal and South Africa in November 2017. And there was two suspect decisions in the game. One, which is pictured, a handball called for a penalty, which clearly wasn't, and he allowed a quick restart after a foul, which directly resulted in a South African goal. So the match finished 2-1, and after the match, 5 separate organisations got in touch with FIFA to flag suspicious betting patterns, and in particular, the market which had been corrupted was the market for how many goals would be on the match. And in particular that there would be 2 or more goals in the match. And in the first 40 minutes of the match, whilst the game remained 0-0, the market didn't move, notwithstanding the elapse of time, which would usually cause the odds of 2 or more goals being scored to go down. So it was like the market knew something. So ultimately, the case ended up before CAS, and the panel found that a link exists between the deviation in the betting patterns and the field decisions, as each of them, inexplicable if taken alone, appears to find an explanation only in the other. So there was evidence that the probability of the betting markets not moving in that way was basically 99.5%. sure that something was behind it. So ultimately, the match was ordered to be replayed, and the result was reversed. Senegal won the replay, and Lamptey was banned from the sport for life. And the important thing to stress is that the two strands of evidence in this case were the video evidence of the decisions and the betting evidence. There was no link ever established between the referee and whoever was putting the money on these markets. So for education, a strong education program is the bedrock of any integrity program, of any defense against corruption. There's a case in English football, Joey Barton, a high-profile English footballer. It was uncovered in 2017 that he had been betting. So over a 10-year period, he had placed over 1,000 bets on football matches, including 40 bets on matches involving teams that he was a member of. And although he pled guilty in the case, he sought to rely on his ignorance or lack of understanding of the rules and how serious these offences were. And it's important, obviously, that ignorance can never be a defence to integrity issues. So 5, structure. There should be some form of delineation or separation between the integrity function and the part of the sport that generates the revenues. Ideally, there'll be some form of independence of oversight and governance, and funding needs to be secured. So I've used the athletics integrity unit as an example of what these structures can look like and the level of independence which is generally built in. I think it's important to understand the structures within American sport and how American sport is structured are generally quite different to European sport and British sport. And again, there is no one-size-fits-all solution. The structures that are best fit for practice in the UK, in the US, will be slightly different. So 6, personnel. So an integrity function needs to be made up of diverse subject matter experts. So when integrity functions were first established in the 2000s in a number of sports, they tend to be based on ex-police officers, people with investigative experience. But it's really important that the integrity function is staffed by people with specific expertise of that particular sport, with people who understand betting markets, with people who are very conversant in data, and particularly in relation to betting data. Also, it'll need support from legal, pure audit. Language skills are something to be borne in mind depending on the participants within the sport. That's particularly important in the education programs. And I thought this job ad is interesting. So the NBA are currently advertising for a data analyst with experience in betting markets to work within its integrity team. And this is evidence of the growing sophistication of the US leagues in relation to these issues and how they're building their integrity functions. The job remains open. It's actually on the Sloan jobs board at the moment. So if there is anyone in the room who's interested, then I encourage you to apply. Consideration 7. I was going to make a joke about taking commission, but I thought in an integrity talk that probably isn't. It's probably not right. Consideration 7, relationship with law enforcement. So it's important that sport is conscious of its relationship with law enforcement. And it can be important because obviously, however strong an integrity function's powers are, they will never be as strong as law enforcement, powers like search and seizure, etc. However, there is a potential downside because the involvement of law enforcement can slow the process and ultimately hinder disciplinary action. We've been involved in a couple of cases. But one case study, which is recent, involving 2 Italian tennis players. So they were doubles tennis team, a good team. They got to the semi-finals of the French Open in 2012. But there was evidence that they had conspired to corrupt a match in 2011. Tennis started to investigate. The criminal system in Italy got involved. Charges were pressed. It wound its way slowly through the Italian system. Ultimately, they were acquitted by one of the highest courts in Italy in 2018. And it was only at that point that tennis was able to get involved, press charges, and sanction them. And they received bans of a life ban and 10-year ban, respectively. But that was 2018, 7 years after the match in question. And during that period, they continued to play professional tennis. So then 8, tools of the sport's integrity function. There's broadly 2 main pots of tools. preventative tools and investigative tools. So prevention, the sport needs to be able to control its on-site security to exclude and control who gets in, and particularly who has access to the participants. Live monitoring of betting markets, we've already talked about how important that is. The ability to act on warnings, to make provisional suspensions. Warning off is a way of excluding bad actors from your premises, from your sport, including individuals who aren't subject to the rules of the sport, so non-participants who are, as I said, potential corruptors. And then potentially use of integrity testing, although that can be difficult from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So part 2 then is investigative tools. So that's being able to carry out interviews, inspecting personal records, property, phones. An offense for non-compliance, so for participants who don't comply with the integrity function. The existence of a strong whistleblowing structure to allow that to take place. And also allowing for substantial assistance, so basically for individuals who are involved but who assist the authorities, and which can be used as a mitigating factor. So finally then, Donaghy. So Donaghy, this has come back to light in the last couple of weeks, come back to prominence in the last couple of weeks following an ESPN investigation. And it is difficult in hindsight, given the lack of data and the lack of information available, to establish whether or not matches were corrupted. But if you look at Lamptey, the case that we just discussed, which was another case involving a referee, it shows how a modern integrity function can quickly identify corrupt behavior and then successfully build a case, notwithstanding the absence of primary evidence. And to finish and to leave you with, I suppose, a positive takeaway from this talk, the growth and change in sports betting does increase the susceptibility of sport to corruption. However, it's our view that the presence of regulated betting markets, the sharing of betting data, and in particular I'd echo the NBA's call to ensure that all betting operators in the US are obliged to share betting alerts with the sports, and the growth and development of sophisticated integrity functions which aren't just reliant on putting up bronze statues, that they put sport in a good position to deal with people who are tempted to go down the path of a Donaghy or Youplus. Thank you. So I think we have some time for questions. Yeah.
Don't the pro sports leagues in the U.S. encourage tanking by having a player draft more bad teams rather than good teams?
So the question is whether pro sports leagues in the US encourage tanking. I don't think they encourage tanking, and I think that's not their position. There are incentives in some US team sports in relation to underperformance that don't exist in every other sport. Those incentives of themselves aren't an issue, and in particular, easily predictable underperformance isn't an issue. So if everyone knows about an incentive and the team is encouraged in relation to that incentive, then that's not going to cause an issue in a betting market. It's where there's information that isn't in the market that's just within the individuals that the particular issue arises. Yeah, at the back. So it will, yes. I mean, yes, broadly, but it will be the bookmaker itself that will be able to do that. Yes. But what the sport can do, and what the sport should be able to do, what we recommend that they can do is that they can suspend the streaming or the provision of data on a market. So the question is whether all bets would be suspended or whether it... No, they act individually, but one tends to follow the other pretty quickly. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you have any data in terms of whether more attempts at corrupting officials versus corrupting players?
I haven't seen any particular data on that, but I suppose we've discussed two cases specifically relating to officials in this talk, but I think more broadly, there are more cases involving participants than officials. Yeah.
Are there standards being established for how much review needs to build a case against someone by the legal?
Yep. Yeah, so the question is whether about the burden of proof in fixing cases. And that does vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction and even from sport to sport. But I think when you're dealing with taking away someone's livelihood, it is a higher burden of proof will generally be sought than the balance of probabilities. So a lot of the sports in the UK will use a comfortable satisfaction. So that is a percentage higher than 50.1, but it's not beyond a reasonable doubt. So it's an intermediary level. Okay. Yes?
Your work on the tennis channel, what role did court-siding play in your analysis of how it affected
it was certainly a very substantial factor. It was substantial in a number of different ways. It was because it leads to arguments that, court-siding, for those who don't know, court-siding is effectively the collection of unofficial data by people at the match. And in tennis or in other sports where the infrastructure around the sport is limited, then there's an integrity issue because basically the people who are collecting that data can sometimes be people who then seek to affect the outcome of the match. So there was a specific integrity concern addressed issue around that. Whereas in bigger, more sophisticated sports, so let's say in the Premier League or in the NBA, someone who's collecting data at an event isn't necessarily posing a specific integrity threat, but they are undermining the position of the official data, which is an issue of itself. We've got one more. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, your second proposition was limiting the data. I don't see how that actually helps because it feels that like having fast and reliable data would eliminate court-siding, and most of the corruption happens in the pregame and not during the game. It seems having the data would make things more open, eliminate court-siding, etc.
Yeah. So court-siding isn't an issue in and of itself. I mean, I agree that would address court-siding, but court-siding is just one of the, and not the most primary kind of roots of the issue. I suppose when you look at the chart of what happened when the data was sold and the level of integrity concerns that suddenly arose. So the argument is basically, can you put the genie back in the bottle? Can you go back to the position where the data wasn't available and no one bet on it? Because you have to understand, this is tennis that there are no spectators. No one watches it, live, whether in person or streamed. This is something that no one had ever thought to bet on until the availability of the data. So the argument is, you shut off the data, there's no streaming, no one's going to bet on it. Well, I mean, we'll see, but that is the outcome of the review. And that won't be, it's not, you can't shut off the data stream for the Premier League and say, okay, no one's going to bet on the Premier League anymore. But this is, a very, very low level of sport that people hadn't previously ever bet on. Okay, great. Thank you very much.